they lose the connection. Well, Tori had the question. How will they ensure that grades are awarded fairly when it comes to things such as valedictorian? You want to address that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, the perception of the teacher is embedded in every single grade. So in very few, if not, there might not be any instances, the students who are competing for the, top percentile, valedictorian, salutatorian, they, in very few cases, have an identical transcript, meaning they had all of the same teachers. They might have some of the same teachers. They might have a lot of the same teachers, but in very few cases will they have all of the same teacher. So there's always going to be some element in there, and some of that is going to be related to trust, right? We trust that our teacher corps are grading at a, high level. We're trusting a higher level of rigor that's, being instituted. Now, in this case, because we're now talking about second semester grades, if I were to address Tori's question, we're talking about second semester grades because everyone was there for the first semester.
Right.
So it was just done in the traditional manner. So within the second semester, there should not be some great inflation of performance that could not be verified. Now, in our case, students are still submitting the work. Right? So it's not as if you take a student who was totally disengaged and, we're talking about the top few students in this case. So to answer Tori's question, some of those things are still going to be there. But again, with assessments being rigorous, some of that competition, I would just suggest to Tori and every other student who's pushing for valedictorian or salutatorian or top 1% or top 5% to keep trying their absolute best. Hopefully that other students they're competing with, that other student, I'm going to assume good intent, is also doing the same. Now, the reality is whether or not they achieve that top level, they're going to get better simply by academically competing. So I'm very proud of Tori, I don't know if Tori's male or female, but I'm very proud of that student for asking that question. But within there, I would say it's going to the same exact experience that you would have in the classroom, we're still going to have now.
Absolutely.
We're hoping that our teachers, still hold themselves to a high standard, that we still keep our expectations high, and that we don't water down our education because no one wins there.
Okay, Dr. King, I'm going to take a quick second for a break for our sponsors. To our audience, you are listening to Let's Chew the Gum, the podcast where we talk about everything from A to Z, and where we oftentimes chew gum like I'm doing now. Who says you can't chew gum and talk? I think it gives you a great rhythm and motivation to keep going. If you are enjoying the show, no matter what platform you're listening to now, we are also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, RadioPublic, Spreaker, and of course, YouTube. Tune in usually Tuesdays and Friday nights, and we will see how that goes. Feel free to call in with show topics or topics you want to have discussions about yourself. We'll be right back.
Something for your mind. Something for your mind.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Something for your mind.
Thank you for listening to our sponsor, and we hope you enjoyed that break. We're back here on Let's Chew the Gum with our special guest, Dr. Derek King, Assistant Superintendent of Student Services for Excelsior Charter Schools. Am I saying that correctly, Dr. King?
Absolutely. You got it perfect.
Great. So we're going to continue our discussion on the topic of distance education and all that entails. When we left off, we were having a great discussion about the validity of distance learning education, addressing the various modalities of learning and reliability. And we had an online question from Tori from Oklahoma that Dr. King addressed in an eloquent way regarding valedictorian and making sure that that's assessed fairly for those students that have worked hard. I wanted to talk now, Dr. King, about access. We may have touched upon it briefly, but access in terms of students who are in locations where they maybe not have internet access, where situations where students may not be able to afford internet access. Or, for example, in my area, the internet access is so bad that if you don't have a particular plan, you won't receive a signal because there's radio towers. So we have all those types of situations. Sure. And then we have to also look at students that don't have maybe Chromebooks. I know a lot of districts provide those, but some don't. So we have a lot of, and I've mentioned students, but also for the educators. Educators, we may assume they have internet access or sufficient bandwidth, et cetera. So let's talk about that and what that might look like in this situation.
So in our case, understanding that, so we try to ask ourselves the hard questions ahead of time, because we really believe if something can't survive a conversation, can't survive execution. Right. So we actually did a good job of understanding which ones of our families did not have internet access before we actually had to leave. Right. So we clearly understood down to the student who did not have internet access. Now, all of our students happen to already have one-to-one devices. So they either have a Chromebook and or an iPad. But what we needed to do in those cases, if the students did not have internet access, thankfully, there was two organizations that actually stepped up. So I want to publicly say thank you to both Comcast and Spectrum. So for any K-12 student that did not have access to the internet right now during this time of the 24-hour stay-home order, they can actually receive it for free. And we actually used our IT staff to be able to walk those families through getting signed up for that. Now, in some cases, though, you had families where, to your point, it was spotty in those areas, or maybe there wasn't coverage there. And so in our case, what we did was we actually allowed them to sign out 3G iPads, meaning iPads that already had internet embedded in them. Now, as it relates to our staff, that same step was actually taken. Even our staff members, the ones who, like I mentioned before, we have some people who are answering the phone from 8 to 4, where they're not answering their own personal phones because the phone is being forwarded to a number. Well, we actually went out and bought more cell phones and issued those out to the staff members that way, because otherwise you would have people, once they receive that person's number, they'll be calling you at 7 and 8 o'clock at night. Remember,
absolutely.
Educators are people too. We have families too. You have to be able to cut it on and cut it off. And so we're very, very mindful of that. So the equity and access piece always matters. But specifically when you're talking about distance learning, because there needs to be technology involved in the process. So any LEA that decides to take these steps, we have to be mindful and ready to be able to fill in those deficits.
Absolutely. Well put. That is definitely a concern I hear, even prior to the distance learning situation we're in now, where some students have not had access, et cetera. You know, my next thought when I'm hearing that, and it's an appropriate answer. My next thought is, what about schools that don't have that funding to go out and purchase those items for their students? Schools that don't receive the funding or don't have the sponsorships or the parent groups that fundraise. How are we looking at that?
So I would give this advice. There's a ton of grants that are always available for these types of things. Even after we went out on the stay order, there's a few emergency grants that are actually available too. And so just like anything else, you have to get good at being able to tell your story, right? But telling your story through the use of data, being able to clearly explain why you have this particular need for data, identifying your student populations, whether that was done through socioeconomically, and you can easily use your free and reduced matrix. You can actually use individual families. You can use whatever it is you actually need to use there's a lot of funds that are out there and available to be able to purchase certain items or purchase those things for those families to be able to instruct them via distance.
That's great.
And the other piece I would say to that, though, is we all, have local control accountability plans, right? So within that local control accountability plan, we should be identifying special populations and those needs for those populations to close that academic performance gap, right? Absolutely. Now, if that academic performance gap could exist because there is a deficit in instructional supports, right? That instructional support could be a device. So LEAs, school districts, schools need to identify year over year. When you look at a budget, the best way I can answer it this way is when you look at a budget, you can tell what your priorities are. Are your priorities the students or are your priorities something else, right? If there's nothing in that budget to be able to address those deficits, that means you are clearly saying those deficits are not as important as you might state.
Well put.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. That's why I'm always telling parent groups or individuals in the community that I come across that it's imperative that they attend their local control funding formula meetings when they're talking about the local control funding of the plan. They need to attend. Mm-hmm. They need to be there represented. Yes. They need to make their voices and their needs heard. And oftentimes, if individuals aren't out there, as you said, doing a good job of telling their story and their needs, right, sometimes it's assumed that it's not needed. I think it'd be an oversight on anyone in leadership to not know that's a need, and we shouldn't have to have parents that need to come out and say that. But sometimes it needs to be emphasized because you can't assume that the individuals making those decisions, that, again, that's a priority to them, right? We learned early on that, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, right? So you have to speak up and be present in those situations. It's much like the importance of filling out the census, and we could go on a whole show about that as well.
Absolutely.
That'll be a different show. We'll do a show on the importance of the census next time.
Absolutely.
No, that's great. So along with the access point, and I'm not sure if this is going to change or how this may change. I know there's a lot of discussion between labor unions and management in some instances, or just individuals, legislators, etc., about if there needs to be a restructured or an additional compensation model for educators that may not have internet access. Right. I do know some educators that don't at home. I know some that don't have technology at home at all, and that's the way they choose. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But in this situation where they may have to, will they be compensated if they have to acquire or to pay for those services? I know you spoke that Comcast and another company
and Charter Spectrum
have provided, and I don't know if they're providing that for educators as well. And if not, again, does there need to be a compensation model that considers that, or if teachers have the capabilities, but they don't have enough speed at home to accommodate the demands that's going to put on their network?
Absolutely. So one of the things we always need to consider, going back to an educator as a person, right? We should never, and even though this is part of all of our lives, buying things for our classrooms and stuff like that, but we should never harm a teacher in order for them to be able to do their job, right? And what I mean by that is whether that's compensation, to be able to fill in that deficit for now, I'm requiring you to have internet access in order to be able to deliver instruction. So I'm the one creating that bill at your house. So I need to be able to resolve it in some manner. If you can't resolve it that way, you can always resolve it by providing them a device that has an embedded internet that the LEA is actually paying for. But one way or the other, no matter how it's done, whether it's done between the labor unions or whether it's done via reimbursement, some type of compensation, whatnot, it should be done. Because if we're saying that in order for you to do your job and you weren't hired that way, but now we're requiring that of you, we should then be the ones filling in the gap. We should not be creating a fiscal deficit at your house Because if you didn't have the internet before and now you have to have it because of something outside of your control and it's required